Hi everyone, I'm Shree. I'm your English educator for 11th and 12th grade. I've done my BA honors in English and I really like English, so I'm very much looking forward to learning it with you and getting to know you all too. Today's lesson is pre-recorded, which means that we won't get to directly interact. But if you have any questions, whether it's about a phrase that I use or a phrase in the story or a word that you don't understand or maybe some idea that I've discussed that you didn't completely think made sense, then drop a comment and I will definitely get back to you about it. I will also do my best to go slowly and take us through every part of the lesson and be very clear. But if you have any questions at all, then please feel absolutely free to ask them in the comments. And with that said, today we're going to be starting our first lesson of 12th grade. It's the first lesson in the Flamingo textbook. It is the last lesson by Alphonse Daudet. It seems like a bit of a bad joke to say that our first lesson is going to be the last lesson, but this lesson is actually a great start to the year. Not only is it full of a lot of emotion, it's also a very thoughtful lesson, and it thinks a lot about education, which is what we're here to do. So it's a really fitting, appropriate start to the year. Before we get into the lesson itself, I will give you a quick brief on the author. The author's name is Alphonse Daudet. He is a Frenchman and he is mostly a novelist, but he also writes short stories, and we're going to be reading one of his short stories today. If you want to check out more of his short stories, you should go look for translations of them online, and if you read them, let me know what you think. So today's lesson is the last lesson. It was published in 1873, but it's actually set, the story is set in 1870 to 71, which is the year that this thing called the Franco-Prussian War happened. Now, what is the Franco-Prussian War? It is a war between France and Prussia. Prussia is a country that doesn't exist anymore, but it broke up into Germany, Austria and Poland, and parts of these three countries were what used to be considered Prussia back during the 1870s. So what happens is France and Prussia are having a war, and in the setting of the story, it's set immediately after these two places in France called Alsace and Lorraine have been invaded by Prussia. Alsace and Lorraine are on the border of France, and both of these places have been taken over by the Prussians. What happens after that? And that's what we're going to see in today's story. We're going to get to the story now, and how we're going to do the story is we're going to read bits of it. We're going to try to understand the meaning of the sentences as we read them. And then after that, after we read like 2 or 3 paragraphs, we're going to stop and think about some of the themes in those paragraphs. Does that sound good? Okay, let's start. I started for school very late that morning and was in great dread of a scolding, especially because M. Amel had said that he would question us on participles, and I did not know the first word about them. Okay, so let me just pick up my laser pointer. Yeah. So as we start the story, we realize that it's a first person story, and so there is a narrator who we're going to be following very closely. We don't know the name of the narrator yet, but I'm going to tell you. His name is Franz. He is a little boy, and this is the person from whose eyes we will see all the events of the story play out. So Franz tells us, I started for school very late that morning and was in great dread of a scolding. So Franz is late for school. He started later than he's supposed to start, and so he's afraid that he's going to get yelled at in school. especially because MML, M here stands for Monsieur, which is the French word for Mister. This is a name, the name of the schoolmaster in the school, and his name is Amel. All the names in the story are interesting because they all have French pronunciations. I went and looked them up and tried to practice them a bit for this story. If you're interested, you should also go look them up and listen to them and sort of see how they're pronounced, because it's a fun way to kind of get into the story. So the schoolmaster had said that he would give the students a test. He would question us on participles. Participles are a segment of grammar, and I did not know the first word about them. So Franz is afraid of going to school for two reasons. One, he is late to school already, and two, there's going to be a quiz that day on participles, and Franz says that he doesn't know even the first word about participles. So he knows nothing at all about participles, and so he's afraid of going to school. For a moment, I thought of running away and spending the day out of doors. As is normal when you're afraid of something sometimes, Franz's first thought is that maybe he should just escape it. He should bunk school that day and spend the day outside, maybe play, do something else. And Franz goes on to say, it was so warm, so bright. The birds were chirping at the edge of the woods, and in the open field back of the sawmill, the Prussian soldiers were drilling. So Franz tells us that the day outside is warm, it's bright, it's beautiful. So he's feeling very attracted to the thought of being outside. He's like, this is so great. Why don't I just stay here? And the birds are singing, and it's overall, nature is very attractive to him that day. And at the end of this, he also adds that in the open field back of the sawmill, the Prussian soldiers were drilling. You know, this is an interesting sentence, because when a sentence starts with the birds were chirping, you expect the sentence to finish with something like the birds were chirping and the bees were humming, or the birds were chirping and there was a nice breeze. You expect it to be something nice that follows up the singing birds. But instead, this sentence ends with the Prussian soldiers were drilling. Drilling here doesn't mean drilling with like an electric drill. It means they were training, they were running exercises. And the Prussian soldiers were the ones who were drilling. So this immediately tells us that Prussia is inside Alsace, that the soldiers are actually directly there within the city of Alsace, and they are the ones who are practicing and training right in the city that they've taken over, right? So this is actually a very sort of dark ending to that line. But anyway, Franz still finds that more attractive, and he says it was all much more tempting than the rule for participles. So all of this to Franz is a lot more compelling than learning grammar. But I had the strength to resist and hurried off to school. But Franz decides to fight his wish to run away and his wish to stay outside, and he decides to go off to school. When I passed the town hall, there was a crowd in front of the bulletin board. So Franz is on the way to school, and on the way he's passing this particular place where there's the town hall, which is like the center of the town, an important place to the town. And there's a bulletin board there, and there's a crowd around that bulletin board. And immediately that's also interesting, because if a crowd is around a bulletin board on which possibly news is being put up, then something of importance has happened. For the last 2 years, all our bad news had come from there. The lost battles, the draft, the orders of the commanding officer. So Franz tells us that for the last 2 years, every bit of bad news that the town of Alsace had come from that bulletin board. And what is this bad news? The battles that are being lost, the draft. The draft is the military draft. In some very dire situations, what happens is that a country sets up a draft, a military draft, and then people of a certain age will compulsorily have to join the military and be part of it. That's what a military draft is. The orders of the commanding officer. So Franz tells us all these things were bad, like whatever happened because of them was bad, and they themselves are bad. And he tells us, and I thought to myself without stopping, what can be the matter now? So the moment that there's a crowd and it's in front of the bulletin board, Franz knows, because of his experience over the last 2 years, that it is likely to be some kind of news that isn't good. And as he runs by them, he stops to think, oh no, what's happened today? But he keeps going because he has to go to school. Then, as I hurried by as fast as I could go, the blacksmith walked up, who was there with his apprentice reading the bulletin, called after me, "Don't go so fast, Bub. You'll get to your school in plenty of time." Franz is running by, and somebody who is at the bulletin, like who's already read it, with his and the person who does this is Wachter. Wachter is there with his apprentice. An apprentice is sort of somebody who's just starting to learn the trade. So Wachter and his apprentice are reading the bulletin, and Wachter calls out to Franz and says, "Don't go so fast, you'll get to your school in time." And Franz thinks, I thought he was making fun of me, which makes sense. It could be a very sarcastic statement saying, oh, you'll get to your school in plenty of time, but actually meaning, oh, you're already late, so how are you going to get to school in time? And reached Monsieur Amel's little garden all out of breath. So Franz has finally reached the garden of the school, and he is entirely out of breath because he's been running and rushing. And we're gonna, so these are the 2 paragraphs that we've read so far. And what do these paragraphs tell us, right? First, they give us quite a lot of characteristics of our narrator. What do we know of Franz from the last 2 paragraphs? I'm going to give you like 5 seconds to think about it, and then I'm going to talk to you about it. Okay, so what we know about Franz is that he doesn't find school the best thing. He's not very interested in school. He likes the outside. He finds himself attracted to being outside. But despite all this, he also has a sense of duty, because there's a reason that despite not wanting to go to school and despite wanting to be outside, he chooses to go to school anyway. So he shows there some sense of responsibility, and that's an interesting mix of characteristics in our narrator. Now, the second thing that we know is that there is a war, and we know that our narrator is on the losing side. And how do we know this? Because the story is set in Alsace, and the narrator tells us that there are drilling Prussian soldiers, which means that the enemy is in Alsace. We know that there's been a draft. We know that tells us there's been a war. We know there are commanding officers involved and lost battles, which also tells us there's been war. And bad news also tells us that our narrator is on the losing side. And above and beyond these 2 things, we also know that something odd is happening because of this bulletin board and because of this comment that Wachter makes, which Franz thinks isn't fun. But is it just Wachter poking fun at Franz? As Franz finds out when he actually goes to school, possibly not. Possibly Wachter meant what he said in utter seriousness. Usually, when school began, there was a great bustle which could be heard out in the street, the opening and closing of desks, lessons repeated in unison, very loud, with our hands over our ears to understand better, and the teacher's great ruler rapping on the table. So this starts out with Franz telling us what school usually is like. There is a great bustle. A bustle is a lot of movement and a lot of noise, and there's so much that you can hear it all the way outside in the streets. And what is this bustle? It's the opening and closing of desks. I know that most schools don't have desks that we can open and close, but in this school the desks can be opened and closed. Presumably they kept things in them and they took things out of them. Lessons repeated in unison. So all the students are saying their lessons together at the same time, and they're saying it very loud, and they're saying it with our hands over our ears to understand better. So they're saying it like this, with their hands over their own ears. And why does this help them understand better? Because that way they can actually focus on what they're saying rather than listening to the loudness of everybody else. If a classroom is sort of all yelling the same thing at the same time, then you get distracted by listening to everyone. So hands over your ears helps you focus on what you're saying. And in the midst of all of this, Monsieur Amel is also, he's got this big ruler and he's kind of just tapping it on the table repeatedly. Franz tells us that this is how school normally is. But now it was all so still. But today, something is different. I had counted on the commotion to get to my desk without being seen. But of course, that day everything had to be as quiet as Sunday morning. So Franz is late and his plan had been, oh, it's going to be so loud in there, it's going to be so busy, there's going to be so much happening that I can just slip inside the classroom and nobody will see me. But to his bad luck, that day everything is very, very quiet as Sunday morning. So this is a comparison that's being made. It's a simile, which is just a comparison. He's saying that it's as quiet as Sunday morning. So Sunday mornings in school are very quiet because there are no classes that happen on Sunday, and Franz is very surprised by that kind of quietness in his school, because that's not what usually happens. Through the window I saw my classmates already in their places, and Monsieur Amel walking up and down with his terrible iron ruler under his arm. So Franz peeks in through the window and he sees that all of his classmates are already sitting in the right places, and his teacher is walking up and down, and his teacher has that very scary iron ruler in his arm, under his arm. And Franz is like, oh no. I had to open the door and go in before everybody. You can imagine how I blushed and how frightened I was. So Franz realizes that he has to open the door and go in while everybody sees him, because everyone's already in their places. They're all going to notice him as he walks in, and so he's very embarrassed. He's kind of going pink in the cheeks because he's shy and he's embarrassed and he's frightened. But nothing happened. Monsieur Amel saw me and said very kindly, "Go to your place quickly, little Franz. We were beginning without you." So not only is school unusual today in the sense that, first of all, it's very quiet. It's also unusual because nothing happened. Franz expected a scolding, he goes in late, but nothing happens. Monsieur Amel sees him and just says very sweetly, "Go to your place and sit down. We were going to start without you." And that's all. I jumped over the bench and sat down at my desk. Franz just jumps over the bench to sit down. Okay. Not till then, when I had got a little over my fright, did I see that our teacher had on his beautiful green coat, his frilled shirt, and the little black silk cap, all embroidered, that he never wore except on inspection and prize days. So Franz sits down and he is finally not that afraid anymore, and so he starts being able to pay attention to what's going on around him. And he notices first that Monsieur Amel is really dressed up. He's wearing his green coat and his frilled shirt and a little black silk cap which is embroidered. And Franz knows this outfit. He's seen Monsieur Amel wear this outfit before, and his teacher wears this outfit on inspection days and prize days. So special days, important days. It's one of those outfits that you keep saved for a relevant day in your life. And so Franz is like, what is going on? Besides, the whole school seems so strange and solemn. Solemn means serious. So the entire school is strange and serious, and the teacher is in this special day outfit. But the thing that surprised me most was to see on the back benches that were always empty, the village people sitting quietly like ourselves. So what surprises Franz the most, beyond all of these things that are strange, is that today, for some reason, the people of the village are also sitting in school, like the students. Who are these people who are there? Old Hasa with his three-cornered hat. This is someone. The former mayor, who is an important person, presumably, and is sitting in the class too. The former postmaster. The postmaster heads the post office, and this is someone who used to head the post office, and several others besides. Everybody looked sad, and Hasa had brought an old primer, thumbed at the edges, and he held it open on his knees, with his great spectacles lying across the pages. So all of these people who are sitting in the back benches, the people of the village who showed up to school that day, everyone looks sad. And Franz notices that one of the people has also brought their old primer. A primer is an introductory textbook to something, and the primer is thumbed at the edges, which means that it's, if you've opened a book and looked through it a lot, the edges get sort of older, more worn out than the rest of the book. So it's been thumbed at the edges and you can actually see it. That's how much it's been looked through. And this man has the book open on his knees with his spectacles lying on it. And this is all very odd. So from these two paragraphs, what we get is an attempt to set up a difference between the general atmosphere of school and today. The author is trying to show us how today is very, very different from normal. Not only is it extremely silent, not only is everything that's expected to happen, like Franz getting a scolding, not happening. There are all these people there. There's also this sadness and this seriousness to the day. While I was wondering about it all, now Franz is curious about what's happening, like we are too. And while that's happening, Monsieur Hamel mounted his chair. So Monsieur Hamel gets on his chair, and in the same grave and gentle tone which he had used to me, said. So Monsieur Hamel is speaking in this grave, which means serious, and gentle, which is gentle, soft. So in that tone, he says to them, "My children, this is the last lesson I shall give you. The order has come from Berlin to teach only German in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. The new master comes tomorrow. This is your last French lesson. I want you to be very attentive." So Monsieur Hamel tells them, he explains the reason for this serious, solemn, sad atmosphere, which is that today is going to be the last time he teaches them. This is going to be the last lesson that he gives them. And why is that? He says that the order has come from Berlin. Berlin is the current capital of Germany, so it's a center of Russia also. And so because we know that the Prussian army has invaded Alsace and Lorraine, they're giving commands to Alsace and Lorraine. And what is the command that they've given this time? To teach only German in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. So Alsace and Lorraine are in France, right? They generally learn French. But now, because Prussia has taken over, they want only German to be taught in these locations. So they've given an order to make that happen. And the new master, who is going to teach them German, comes tomorrow. this is your last French lesson. It's very sad news. The Monsieur Amel tells them that this is the last time I'm going to be teaching you French. And so he says, and I want you to be very attentive. Now, it's a question to ask right now is, why stop teaching French? I'm going to let you think about it for around 5 seconds, and then I'm going to start talking. The actual order is, the order has come from Berlin to only teach German. So another question to think about is, why only German? Why stop teaching French? Why not both? And I'm going to let you think about that too for a couple of seconds. Okay. So think about this. This is French territory, right? So they're all used to speaking French to each other. This is the language that they've grown up speaking probably, and that they've been living with for a really long time. And this language has been passed down across generations. It's a common link between all the people who live there today and presumably all the people who lived there before them also. So it's a sense of belonging that the language can create, a common language. And because they've been living and speaking French for so long, they probably have some sort of attachment to French, right? Now, what's happened is Prussia has invaded France. A common tactic when it comes to conquering a place, the point of a conquest, right, the point of a war is to try to take over a place and make that place a part of you. So when Prussia wants to take over Alsace and Lorraine, it's going to take them from France and it's going to make them part of itself. And Prussia speaks in German. That's the common language there. So a part of creating that kind of association with Prussia and dividing Alsace and Lorraine from France is trying to stop them from doing the things that they normally do, from living the ways that they normally live, and trying to make them live in the ways that are practiced in Prussia. So now they will only learn German. They will act and speak and teach and live like the people of Prussia. And this is a common strategy that generally takes place when it comes to wars and conquests. People want to extinguish and separate the things that are already present in that land, that sort of already have a way of connecting all of the people to each other there. So, as I said, language connects. There's a sense of belonging, a sense of familiarity, and conquering often includes erasing the old practices of the country that's been captured. Now, another thing that's really important is the setting, right, of this story, which is school. But also, the place that the law is affecting is school. They've not just said you're not allowed to talk French anymore. They said you're not allowed to teach French anymore. So they've directly targeted even teaching in French, right? So this goes to something that perhaps we all forget a lot, which is that, there's a lot of power in education. I think sometimes it gets very misplaced and we get used to memorizing things for our exams, or we get used to treating our subjects like they're just things that need to be memorized and need to be studied. But very often education can be used for things. It's a very powerful tool. The things that you can learn in school can be important. We can teach them in ways that are important. We can learn them in ways that are important. And and in this moment we see the power of school in a way, because by forbidding the teaching of French in schools, what happens is that an entire generation will be cut off from French. They'll just never learn French, right? It's a very smart tactic, because it means that an entire group of people, everyone who's just growing up, will just not know this language at all. Instead, they'll be forced to grow up and learn and speak in a different language. Sorry about that. They'll be forced to learn and speak in a different language. And this is the sort of tactic that also is used a lot in wars. Education gets affected by the agendas of people in power. This is one way. They'll just completely omit teaching something. They'll just completely erase a segment of a syllabus and be like, okay, we're not going to teach you this, so you'll just never know this, and so you'll just never be aware of it, and so it'll never mean anything to you. And misinformation is another way of using education. If from your childhood, for instance, in school they've taught you that 5 plus 3 is equal to 9, that's a very small change, right? It's 5 plus 3 is 8, but they teach you that 5 plus 3 is 9. Then it's going to be very difficult by the time you're, say, 35 to change your mind about that. And that's the way that education can be used to shape your minds, to make you think certain things and make you believe certain things are right. And that's also why school and teaching well is important, because if you're being taught in the right ways, then you'll know to question those things for yourself and to ask whether this is really right or this is really wrong. And that's how education ends up being something important. And that's why this lesson is actually a really nice start to this year, because it sort of reminds us that as we go along this year, let's try to make a little bit of an effort to see what's there in every lesson and try to get something out of every lesson that helps us think a bit better. It's not about the content that we're getting so much as the thoughts and the ideas that we're getting, you know? So yeah, getting back to the story. Prussia has forbidden the teaching of French. It's a very effective tactic. What a thunderclap these words were to me. Oh, the wretches! That was what they had put up at the town hall. Franz is shocked. He says these words, this news is like a thunderclap. So it's like thunderclap. Oh, the wretches! That was what they had put up at the town hall. The wretches here are the commanding officers, the order that's coming in from Berlin. And he calls them wretches because this is a wretched decision to make. This is a bad decision to make. This is a decision that he doesn't like, and so he scolds them. And he realizes that this is what had been put up at the town hall. My last French lesson. Why, I hardly knew how to write. I should never learn any more. I must stop there then. So Franz realizes that this is his last French lesson, and he says, I hardly knew how to write French, which tells us that Franz is presumably very young because he's still learning how to write. And he says, oh, I'll never learn anything else. I'll never learn any more of French, and I have to just stop with what I already know of French. I'm never going to be able to learn French in any other way. And he feels, oh, how sorry I was for not learning my lessons, for seeking birds' eggs or going sliding on the Saar. The Saar is a river, and Franz is suddenly feeling a lot of regret. He's sort of like, oh no, all this time that I was in school, I didn't learn these lessons. Instead of learning these lessons, I went and looked for birds' eggs, or I went and slid on the Saar. The Saar is a river, as I said, so when it froze over, they probably went sliding on it. And Franz is regretful for all of the time that he spent doing things that are not paying attention to his lessons. My books that had seemed such a nuisance a while ago, so heavy to carry, my grammar and my history of the saints, were old friends now that I couldn't give up. So Franz says that the books that he has, which it seemed like a nuisance and annoyance a little while ago, which were so heavy to carry, he says that these books, which are his grammar book, and his history of the saints, these two books, he says that although until now he'd been very annoyed by them and he'd found them very heavy to carry, probably literally they were heavy to carry, but also he didn't want to study, so an emotional weight too. But now they're like old friends, and he doesn't want to let go of them. He doesn't want to stop learning them. And Monsieur Hamel too. He also doesn't want to let go of his teacher. The idea that he was going away, that I should never see him again, made me forget all about his ruler and how cranky he was. So Franz suddenly feels that he doesn't want his teacher to go away, even though previously he's been afraid of the ruler, the scale of the teacher, and he's been afraid of how cranky, which is easy to anger. So even though Monsieur Hamel is easy to anger and has this really scary ruler, Franz is suddenly like, I don't think I want you to go away. I think I'm going to miss you. It's a difficult feeling, regret. Feeling as though the time that you've had with something, you only really start to appreciate it when it's on the verge of being taken away from you. That's a terrifying feeling, and that's what Franz is feeling right now. And he's blaming himself for it. And he's found some sort of value in these things as he's about to lose them. And that's very sad. Poor man, Franz is talking about Monsieur Hamel. It was in honor of this last lesson that he had put on his fine Sunday clothes. And now I understood why the old men of the village were sitting there in the back of the room. So Franz says, oh, so this is why, because it's the last day, that Monsieur Hamel is putting on his fine clothes, his good clothes. Sunday is for church generally, so they generally tend to wear better clothes when they go to church. So that's why he says fine Sunday clothes. It's a special day again. And now Franz understands why all the old men of the village were sitting in the back of the room. It was because they were sorry too, that they had not gone to school more. Franz says that all of the old people in the village are also feeling the same regret that he is feeling, that they're also sorry that when they were younger, that they hadn't gone to school or paid it enough attention. It was their way of thanking our master for his 40 years of faithful service and of showing their respect for the country that was theirs no more. Franz tells us that this is the way that the villagers have shown up to say thank you to Monsieur Hamel for spending so long teaching them, for spending so many years teaching them. And it's their way of showing some respect not only to Monsieur Hamel but also to their country, to France, which is no longer theirs. What happens in this sentence is that in some way, the country is no longer theirs because it's been taken over by Prussia. But it seems as though now that French is something that they can't learn anymore, it's going to be stopped. It seems as though they're being separated from their country a little bit more. So the country is theirs no more. The feeling sort of gets highlighted. So now we come to the phrase that we've actually seen around 3-4 times now. This last lesson, the last lesson. Monsieur Hamel also says the phrase. He says the last lesson. So this is the title of the story, right? The last lesson. And it's come to mean so far in the story a lot of things. It's come to mean the last lesson that Monsieur Amel is going to teach, the last lesson that France is going to get taught, and the last lesson of French in their school and in all of Alsace. So this is a lot of lasts, and these are all the lasts that are part of the meaning of the title, the last lesson. So as I said, loss of language feels like a loss of country, which when we read the line showing their respect for the country that was theirs no more, we thought about how French no longer being there meant that their country felt a little less like theirs, even though they'd already been taken over by Prussia. While I was thinking of all this, I heard my name called. It was my turn to recite. So Franz is thinking about all of this, and Monsieur Amel calls his name, and it's Franz's turn to say the lesson out loud. What would I not have given to be able to say that dreadful rule for the participle all through, very loud and clear, and without one mistake? Franz wishes really badly in this moment that he could say that lesson perfectly. He could say that rule perfectly, loudly, clearly, without making even one mistake. He wants to show that he has learned it. He wants to prove that he's learned it, because it's such a good way of showing that you've cared for your lessons so far, right? Especially when your teacher is going to leave you and you're not going to get the chance to study this anymore. You want to show that you've paid attention and you've done well so far, and when something means something to you, or you've realized that something means a lot to you, then you want to do well at it. But I got mixed up on the first words and stood there, holding on to my desk, my heart beating, and not daring to look up. But unfortunately, Franz doesn't do well. He told us he doesn't know even the first word of the participle, and he gets mixed up as he starts speaking. And then he sort of just quiets down and he stands there. He's holding onto his desk. He's looking down. He doesn't want to look up because he's embarrassed, he's shy, he's ashamed, and his heart is beating faster than usual. His heart is always beating. I heard Monsieur Amel say to me, "I won't scold you, little Franz. You must feel bad enough." So I heard Monsieur Amel say to me. Franz is still looking at the desk. He's not seeing Monsieur Amel talk to him. He's just hearing it. "I won't scold you, little Franz. So I'm not going to yell at you. I'm not going to tell you off. I think you already feel bad. You must feel bad enough. See how it is. Every day we've said to ourselves, 'Bah, I've plenty of time. I'll learn it tomorrow.' And Monsieur Amel says, well, every day so far we've spent all this time thinking, oh, we have the rest of our lives. So we'll just learn it some other day. We'll learn it tomorrow, the day after that, and tomorrow never comes. And now you see where we've come out. And now you see where we've all ended up. That's the great trouble with Alsace." So he says, this is the problem with Alsace. She puts off learning till tomorrow. She keeps postponing learning till the next day, till the next day, till the next day. Now those fellows out there, he's referring to the Prussians, will have the right to say to you, "How is it? You pretend to be Frenchmen, and yet you can neither speak nor write your own language." So Monsieur Amel says that the Prussians and people outside France will now have the authority to ask these people in Alsace, "How do you call yourself French when you can't even speak the language?" And we'll talk about this in a little bit. But Monsieur Amel goes on, "But you are not the worst, poor little Franz. We've all a great deal to reproach ourselves with." Monsieur Amel is very clear that this approach of Franz, where he doesn't really place a great priority on his education, isn't only his fault. He says we have all a great deal to reproach ourselves with. Reproach means to tell ourselves off, to regret, to scold ourselves about. Um, and he says all of us are to blame in this. Your parents were not anxious enough to have you learn. They preferred to put you to work on a farm or at the mills so as to have a little more money. So, Monsieur Ramel says, part of the problem is your parents. They didn't put a lot of energy and effort into you learning. They didn't care very much about you learning. Instead, they wanted to send you off to work so that the family could have a little more money. And I've been to blame also. Monsieur Amel says it's also partly his fault. Have I not often sent you to water my flowers instead of learning your lessons? So he openly admits that he also has sometimes sent his students off to do some chores for him instead of learning their lessons. And when I wanted to go fishing, did I not just give you a holiday? And sometimes when he wanted to do something that was not take school for the day, like go fishing, he would just give the school a holiday. So he's also blaming himself here. So Monsieur Amel, when he talks about how they didn't take advantage of the opportunity to learn, he's blaming a lot of things. He's partly giving responsibility to the students, partly to the parents, partly to himself, and partly also a lot to social conditions and circumstance, right? Because there's a reason that the family would rather send these kids off to work rather than make them study. And that's because they presumably need that money. And Monsieur Amel splits this responsibility up amongst all of these things. And in the middle, he also says this line. He says, how is it you pretend to be Frenchmen and yet you can neither speak nor write your own language? He says this is what the Prussians are going to tell you. But what that line thinks is that to be French is to know the language. That if you are to truly belong to the land of France, and if you are to truly call yourself French and declare yourself as someone who belongs to that land, then you have to know the language of the land in order to be able to say that about yourself. That's what that line says, right? It's an interesting question to think about, and we will think about it more next time in detail. For now, I will leave you with that question. Do you have to know the language of the land in order to belong to that land? And we will get back and talk about it more next time. That is all for today's class. I think we have covered the first couple of pages. We'll do the next couple of pages, and we will also do some MCQs if we have time in the second part of this lesson. Your one task for today is to think about that question about language and belonging and whether they both are connected. I hope you liked today's class. If you had any questions, as I've said at the very start of the lesson, please leave them in the comments and I will definitely get back to you. But before we end, I just want to let you know that we are on the platform of Unacademy right now, and there is this thing called Unacademy Plus. You can access a lot more classes like this on Unacademy Plus. You can get taught by a lot of good educators. You have doubt clearing sessions and they'll teach you how to write answers, and we'll cover the entire syllabus, and you'll also get access to study material in PDF format, and you'll have practice tests and things like that. So Unacademy Plus is basically with a lot more features than the classes that you're just getting on YouTube. So if you're interested in that, you should subscribe to Unacademy Plus, and this is the pricing of Unacademy Plus. You can subscribe for a variety of time, any period from 6 months to 24 months. As you can see though, the prices sort of reduce, the per month cost reduce the longer that you subscribe for. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about getting a subscription. If you're interested in a subscription, you can also use this code. It's THAR01. That's my code, and if you use it, you'll get a 10% discount on Unacademy Plus. So that's something to keep in mind also. And There is also another aspect of Unacademy subscription. There is Unacademy Iconic, which is different from Plus in that you'll have more individual attention paid to you. You'll get your own personal mentor. You'll get weekly reports about how you're doing. Your parents can also contact the educators and sort of speak to them about how you're doing. So this is a more individualized study path and a study plan. So if you're interested in getting a lot of one-on-one support, then Unacademy Iconic is what's for you. And this is the pricing. Again, it's for different periods of time, and as you can see, the price per month is also different based on the duration that you take up. So that's something to keep in mind when you sign up. And that said, thank you for being here with me today and for listening to that class. I hope you liked it. If you did, then hit the like button and do subscribe. And if you have any questions, if you have any doubts, leave comments for me. And most importantly, if you have any feedback about today's lesson, what worked for you, what didn't work for you, something you would like me to do differently, then let me know, and I will do my best to start changing the ways that I teach also to better meet what you need. That's all for today. Thank you.